Okay, so I feel like we should start out by trying to define the the field of this investigation, which is it is kind of one of those projects where the field is defined by the analysis, like my thesis. But I mean, a thing that I have been saying forever, and I think most of us have been in some form or another saying forever, and has been arguably an impetus for the existence of Andata Express as a whole, is that contemporary literature, fiction, poetry, maybe even more so, but that's a separate question, has not really figured out how to respond to the internet and its effects on culture, the types of guy with which it has sort of filled out or replaced the database of Lukácsian social types of the conventional realist novel, let's say. Um, and like in for a while that was conventional wisdom, and then at some point it almost flipped over such that the conventional wisdom is no, there are a lot of novels now that are trying to be very online, and people don't like them. like, for the most part. For the most part, people are kind of, like, already sick of this thing that has barely started happening, um, and arguably not to the extent that it needs to still. Um, but also, what people mean by this is itself a or what people are recognizing as this is a very open question, and one that we have to investigate by just looking at some of the examples. Because it turns out the online voice in literature, as it's manifested as a thing, is it's not even that dependent on, say, featuring the internet as a social milieu, which also has not really picked up to the extent one might expect, and a lot is kind of still in the terrain of Tao-Lin a decade ago, putting G chats in novels and stuff like that. Um, but it is a particular a social type that will get norms and assumptions and expectations from online discourse and from specific online discourses. And in many ways, that type is more or less equivalent to the young boy, which I will remind listeners who haven't read the book is not a gendered concept in the sense that it does not mean you have to be literally male. It does not even have to mean you have to be aligned with masculinity in the gender war. The entire type of the quote unquote femcel, which the femcel novel is a big subcategory of this, is a type of female young boy, and the incel novel is the counterpart. We did not read fucking worst boyfriend ever because let's be real, who has time for that? People have already done all the dunking that can probably be milked out of it. Um, Incidentally, how would you define one of these things? Because we are now talking about or around the thing.
Yes.
Um,
Also, side note, I accidentally did not uh, put the OBS on for that. So my quip about
oh, sorry. Okay.
the fact that I went when you mentioned that novel, that my initial reaction to that being brought up was, oh God, not again, because I just finished Paradise Logic by Sophie Kemp. Um, and the last thing I wanted to do was read more of this sort of milieu, but that's kind of an aside. Um, that was actually kind of something that I've been wondering about myself, because at first, when we were kind of talking about this whole internet novel discourse, right? My initial inclination was to try to find the smoking gun that led to what set off this discourse in the first place. Because usually, with these highly discourse laden sort of topics, there's usually some kind of tipping point, some article, some piece of work published recently that causes everyone to suddenly talk about this. What was weird for me was that in this case, like you were kind of talking about, it's less of something that was caused by a specific article or had sort of a flashpoint that led to the discussion, but rather just a sort of ambient concern. And the closest thing I could find to a coherent sort of thing was Blake Butler's commentary on the internet novel, which seems to suggest something that I'm a little more inclined to kind of look for when I want to think about like the internet novel is less as a social milieu and more as a sort of formal concern. Um, because like Blake Butler is kind of responding to this idea that, oh, or at least this concept that is allegedly in this discourse that the reason why a lot of people are frustrated with the internet novel as it seems to exist is that they're looking for instead some great sort of systems novel that adequately and completely assimilates the idea of what the internet is and all of its various consequences. Essentially, they're looking for to be a bit topical about this, something like the tunnel for the internet, or something like infinite jest again for the internet more directly, um, rather than these kind of individual, at best, case studies of types of guy, although that is obviously something that is very relevant to the discussion of the consequences of the internet and its ability to be novelized.
Also note.
Huh?
Sorry.
Oh,
Oh no,
um,
keep going.
yeah. Or these kind of insipid subcultural kind of products from places which I'm sure we'll get to, like Dime Square, which seem to propose themselves as the kind of heirs to this kind of making terminally online of society, the universe, and everything, and producing quote unquote art. Cannot put scare quotes around that term enough. That supposedly is representative of quote unquote our times or being the voice of our generation, as the case may be. So, a lot of my initial inclination again is to kind of see how the novel can adequately accommodate the internet being a thing, in the same way that the novel had to eventually, adequately accommodate expressionism, avant-garde modernist painting, and even cinema itself as these sort of forms. But that might be, I don't want to say overly ambitious, but rather kind of a tangent to the main problem that everyone seems to have, or frustration that everyone seems to have with internet literature writ large as it currently exists.
Well, I don't think it's a tangent except insofar as there is this question, and this question has like loomed over the novel since even before the internet had anywhere near its like current level of social penetration. I
Mhm.
remember like Will Self or somebody saying like way back in the early 2010s or even late 2000s kind of like rehashing modernist predictions of the death of the novel and the death of literature, and saying
Mhm.
there's too much information, attention spans are too short, like it doesn't mean anything to, like, people can't narrativize their existence, which that latter part is strikingly untrue. And one of the most
Mhm.
interesting things about online as a potentially literary phenomenon, I find, is the extent to which people go far out of their way and,
Mhm.
like, to unhealthy degrees that were once the terrain of, like, literary boverism, to, like, narrativize their own existence, and the companies are, like, complicit in this. Spotify was advertising me a playlist called Main Character Energy like 3 months ago. Um, and but this question has been of sort of formal accommodation, has been hanging over literature for at least a couple decades,
Mhm.
and um, to the extent that, like, it largely seemed like literature was just circling the wagons and retreating. And then all the energy of that question seems to have gotten funneled into the branding of a very specific type of novel that accomplishes the reconciliation of, like, the online and the novelistic in an extremely specific way. Um, and you have, and there's a few extremely specific ways, actually.
Mhm.
Um, I'd say another one I didn't get around to for this. I'm forgetting what it was called, but I remember there being one that's just like it's structured like a doom scroll, and it's all
Hmm.
these. It might have been called that, and it's all these sort of like relatably. It's almost prose. Is it doom scroll by Whisper from Whisper House? No, that's a collection of some sort. Um,
Yeah, I'm not immediately
it's not
familiar
by
with
C.G.
this.
Regan, but is it by Sam? Wait, this might have been poetry. But anyway, I've seen a bunch of things that are structured like that, where it's like, no, it's not this either, because this is much more conventional lyric. Um, but where it's just this flow of information like a feed. And the content of that feed is still, I would say, relatively filtered compared to at least what you can get with an actual feed
Mhm.
toward a specific subject position, which is the reading subject position.
Right.
Um, and I'd say this is like the more progressive coded variant. You also have, we'll talk about like the Discourse novel
Mhm.
at some point here, and then there's the kind of like dime square type incel slash femcel, like, online anime character study.
Mhm.
um Again, all of
So,
which, yeah, Alvin, you go now.
on your regards to narrativization, I mean, since you're talking about Spotify using, for example, language of like main character energy, for example, so would that pose then that in order for an actual internet literature to come about, then would it have to go past the kind of um, mechanisms that narrative kind of entails, or rather that I guess now maybe the use of narrative is shown to be a lot less overarching as than what people might think it does, because narrativization is one way of to make sense of the world, and in some sense, aren't a lot of the internet literature works that have been out for a while been been kind of posed as, this is the one book that's going to make sense of our culture, which which it doesn't.
That is a narrativization of literature, yes. And I'm not as like critical of narrativization in and of itself. Again, I think that is partly the false dichotomy that like the will self type perspective set out at the beginning of the 21st century that sort of let the inevitable narrativization that was going to happen get steered in these particular directions. At the same time, there has been this discourse around narrative. I can't remember if that as a category almost eclipsing its own literary origins. I was going to write like I had a I might start writing a Substack article responding to like some of Colin Drum's recent polemics. And particularly coming from the the angle he's taking around like his sort of idealized like woke theopolitics being a return of narrative to the political, and specifically in a recent tweet like what was it, I don't think, just pulling this up. Oh yeah, I think those who believe that consumerism and secularity are permanent equilibrium states for an end of human history are going to be pretty rudely surprised by what happens when the treats stop flowing and all of a sudden people start telling stories again. Which, like, on one level fair, on another level implies a very specific set of assumptions about what stories are and what it means to tell them.
Mm-hmm.
Which is more or less identical to like the one in that one like storytelling animal like
It
pop
does feel
size
a bit
slog
archaic.
book.
It does feel archaic because of the fact that it's almost saying that it needs some sort of necessary apocalypse for people to be telling stories again, which it doesn't need to because there are people that are still telling stories to some extent. It's just that
Right.
it's just taking a different kind of form. It's just
I mean, the difference that he's proposing is that, and it still doesn't apply because, again, like the takeover, like the revenge of narrative politics has been happening at least for the last decade. Like it's one of the most observable phenomena, again, driven by the internet.
Mm-hmm.
But, um, like the assumption, because we're talking about books here, like you can go to a bookstore and there are hundreds, thousands of books, most of which will not be on the shelves 10 years later, which are themselves produced and consumed as a kind of treats,
Mm-hmm.
as database consumption for entertainment. Um, Actually, there's probably a distinction between database consumption and entertainment consumption, but we don't really need to get into that here. Um, it's not like grand narratives that give people meaning, to use the sort of like early post-structuralist sense of narrative. It's not like the interpretation of this narrative is a matter of life or death. That's what the apocalypse needs to bring about, and which, on the other hand, from a kind of like liberal, like security politics perspective, might, on the like conversely, bring about said apocalypse.
Hmm. Yeah, that's kind of a rough version of that at the risk of getting on a tangent about that because my immediate reaction to you reading off Colin Drum's post is that that has been the main mode, I mean, as you said, of politics on a grander scale, but also even on a, let's say, minor scale of at least what has been turned into discourse. And even more morbidly and more macabre sort of versions of this were happening in publishing, right? To get
Hmm.
very dark about this whole thing, I remember shortly after, the genocide in Gaza began in earnest, seeing some novels or memoirs or some variety of such, I forget the exact instance I was seeing, of, presumably from various Palestinian American Palestinian writers. And in the sort of book summary and blurbs of that was the invocation of the own voices kind of matter, of,
Mm.
now more than ever, it's more important to read, for Palestinians to read our stories or to tell our stories or something to that effect, which then, in the wake of all of this, makes it seem much more like stories and narrative are mere consolation prizes to the survivors while the dead continue to die.
Yeah.
In that sense, which, I mean, it is the grossest, but nonetheless more, or if not most, telling instance of the failure state of the whole own voices sort of movement, which was precisely in the name of telling stories as kind of like the emergence of some sort of revolutionary force, or at least so it was sold as such.
Yeah. So that there's a bunch of different like interpretations of story that are at issue here. To get back to the immediate context and like the Blake Butler post again,
Mm-hmm.
and the idea of a great internet novel kind of succeeding the great American novel as a kind of historical narrative holy grail. Um, our Lost Media first podcast ever, way back in 2020, um, dealt with Amygdalatropolis by B.R. Yeager, who would later go on to become with which one is it? Um,
Negative space.
would go yeah with Negative Space, like kind of the breakout hit author of online indie publishing. And Amygdalatropolis, I mean, it's not as big as one of those big maximalist novels, but
Mm-hmm.
it is cited by a lot of people as like the first novel to really get into the guts of the online experience, and specifically like 4chan, and like smaller chans, like niche online, and a specific kind of hikikomori personality, um, and sort of in the stylistic mode that was, maybe still is, associated with quote unquote cyber writing. Um, so that podcast, which also touched on an early not an early YA novel about the internet, which still holds up really well, Feed by MT Anderson, and a kind of like meme novel by YouTube personality Mumkey Jones, was already kind of an internet novel podcast. And then I just kept getting like, because I have become sort of like someone in this niche, I kept getting DMs and messages about like, oh, have you heard of this like novel about fucked up online people? And like it just, or short story collection in many cases too.
Hmm.
And it just was happening often enough that I'm like, okay, there's a pattern, there's a category emerging here. It might be worth covering as a whole thing. Like back when it was Amygdalatropolis, you really had to kind of hunt for this kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, And more and more of these were becoming massive discourse objects in their own right. Like, for distinct reasons. Like, Fuccboi by Sean Thor Conroe, for instance, was accused of, like, ripping off authentic online writer, which
Sam Pink.
Sam Pink. Yeah. So do we want to just go through a quick list of the things we did end up covering? Just the things we're constellating this category around, and also mention some of the ones that we didn't or don't, for various reasons, get around to?
Yeah, sure. Because there's actually like a whole list of books that like I kind of wanted to preface as a sort of case of the investigation is ongoing, because there have been several other novels that have kind of come
Yeah.
up either more recently that I haven't had the chance to read, but I'm kind of interested in. Some things that I've flipped through to a certain degree, and others that have kind of been mentioned. At least as far as books
Low-key, it
that
feels like there's a new one every day now.
yeah, exactly. In fact, there's two of them within the past like couple of months that have been published. Namely The Endless Week by Laura Vasquez, which got a bit of a bump from Blake Butler. It actually kind of sounds like an interesting sort of book, based on, again, kind of treating more of the formal concerns that I'm looking for. And then there was Information Age with Coral Lewis, which seems to speak more to the social milieu part of it. But before I get into the ones that I haven't been able to look at, the ones that I kind of figured we would initially look at when we were first talking about this, that I read through, it, asterisk, mostly, we'll get to it when we get to that, were Fuccboi by Sean Thor Conroe, Rejection by Tony Tulathimutte, and Paradise Logic by Sophie Kemp, with a couple of ones that I've been looking into to some degree, as kind of counterbalances to that, or at least kind of books that seem to offer an interesting kind of complication of this stuff, which would be The Sluts by Dennis Cooper, which I read through all of it. And recently I was thumbing through Hello World by Anna Paletti, released out of
Yeah, this one I
Semiotext.
don't know.
Yeah, that novel in particular is basically about a Australian academic, non-binary, AFAB kind of person who decides to get into BDSM in the wake of basically a collapsing from a horrible breakup from their partner, who basically turned out to be at least allegedly asexual, which then left them with a massive want. And so that led to this main character, named Seasonal, going online to various like kink apps and dating apps and things like that, and eventually encountering a Hungarian man named Laszlo, interestingly enough, who wants to be a sub for that, and kind of documents the exploration and actual sort of contract making of that through like various conversations and encounters, both online and offline. But a lot of, at least a significant chunk of the novel that I've seen so far, are these transcriptions of various messages that have been sent between Seasonal and Laszlo on WhatsApp, if not other various dating apps. So there's this
That
kind of.
sounds interesting,
Mhm.
also as a kind of like inter or counter text to Things Have Gotten Worse Since We Last Talked, which I
Mhm.
recently read and just did not get at all. Um,
Yeah, it was actually kind of Anna Paletti's sort of novel, although, like, obviously, like, Dennis Cooper's The Sluts, which, for those of you who are not aware of that, although I can imagine most of you are if you're listening to this, The Sluts is about a forum, or it takes place basically almost entirely on a forum, although there are very interesting breaks from that, um, for reviewing gay male escorts. And what happens is that there is this repeated review of this person named Brad, who is kind of the main focus of a lot of attention on this forum. But then eventually things take a much darker turn, as often happens in Dennis Cooper novels, which involve various things like the possibility of like snuff films being produced, the possibility of Brad being subject to these snuff films, with increasing acceleration of this stuff, including various turns of various posters lying about what's going on, the very subject of who Brad is being a question of whether this Brad even exists. Some people later on in the novel taking over the role of Brad, and a sort of handler of Brad. I forget the guy's name, unfortunately, or at least the name that he goes by, who claims to be basically kind of the ward of Brad for a little while, increasingly indulging in other people's increasingly violent fantasies, with various fallouts and complications to the narrative that go from there. So it very much becomes the poetic way I would say it is that it's this procession of hungry ghouls howling their desire in the void that is this forum. But it also plays this interesting sort of ball and cups game with the idea of what is reality, how much does desire have to do with reality, and what exactly, how does the internet distort or facilitate these sorts of hyper real formations of desire, with some actually very potent kind of allegorical passages, I would say, that I've bookmarked if we want to get into those at a later time.
Yeah, and I would actually, just from that plot description, say that is one of the more distinctly narratively online seeming of these, in the
Mm-hmm.
way that I've always thought, okay, like the types of stories, this is like to some extent the initial point of investment for me. I've posted several times before, and I'm thinking much more often than that,
Mm-hmm.
like the types of stories I encounter online, the types of lives that I'll see discussed in like in call out posts, or like YouTube like drama, or like even just sort of between mutuals, even like implied by crash outs people have in our server, say, like, are just
Mm-hmm.
way more interesting as a literary subject than
Mm-hmm.
the extremely increasingly narrow scope of what seems to happen in literary fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And this one in particular seems like defined by like a sequence of events dependent on its social context and the structure of that context, in a way where it almost sounds like the kind of thing that could be a creepy pasta,
Mm-hmm.
like, or a sort of like a urban legend YouTube video kind of thing,
Mm-hmm.
but treated in a like realistic, nuanced way, hopefully.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, and the whole thing, I don't know if this is kind of rehashing what we've kind of already discussing when we were setting out terms of this, but the part of the reason why I wanted to go to at least at first the Sluts and then eventually Anna Paletti after I listened to the interview that she had on Writing the Rapids podcast by Joe Bielke, kind of talking about the novel, um, which is like uh, for one, with the Sluts, it was just kind of an idea of, okay, well, here was this example of an internet novel, in quotes, before this became a major object of discourse that everyone pretty unanimously, if they can stand the subject matter, seems to find quite admirable and quite an excellent piece of work, which, for the record, I do agree with those assessments myself. To kind of see what is going on with that and how that's handled, and then in combination with Hello World, from what I've been able to thumb through, it then increasingly brought up the question, which I think is kind of elided in a lot of the discourse that leads to this, which is the question of what internet are we talking about? Because, at least to me, when a lot of people seem to talk about the types of guy that they're increasingly both frustrated with and wanting represented in literature, it seems to me like it's the type of guy or the type of influence of the internet in as much as it is represented in apps. Like what we would see
Yeah.
in Hello World's case, where, at first it's kind of like, this person is going on to it's never really standard stated aside from WhatsApp, but I would imply that they're probably on, like, I don't know, I forget what the kink app that isn't Grinder is. Maybe they were on that. Um, Probably not, but like Hinge or Tinder, and then eventually just pivoting over entirely to WhatsApp once they really start committing to Laszlo.
Wait, is
As
it
like
Fetlife? Just curious.
maybe it's FetLife that I'm thinking of. I forget the exact one, but we'll go with that one just because that's a pretty good one
Yeah.
to go with. And it makes sense given the BDSM sub dom dynamics that are being negotiated in that. But yeah, like, to me, it seems like a lot of people, like, for example, when I hear or see people complaining about, like, people watching like Manosphere shit or like Nick Fuentes shit. It's always they're watching YouTube videos on their phones, or the kinds of neuroses that people are talking about with, like, oh my god, dating sucks, what a hell world, is they're complaining about Tinder specifically. Or a lot of the discourse, despite the fact that it is a website platform as well, the main context that people use Twitter, which I'll still refer to as Twitter, even though I know everyone wants to submit to it being rebranded as X for some ununderstandable reasons, but I'm stubborn like that, um, is predominantly as an app-based platform, app-based microblogging platform specifically. So it seems to me like when everyone talks about being made fully online after COVID, aside from the creation of the iPad baby, which everyone is also kind of moral panicking about. Again, understandably so, but that's a complicated discourse that we may or may not be able to touch on. It seems like everyone's really talking about applications via smartphones, which is oftentimes in that, what was that god awful animation, Are You Lost in the World Like Me, is
Yeah.
very much focused on the imagery of the smartphone as the kind of site of all of contemporaneity's ills, for lack of a better
Yeah.
term.
Yeah, and well, like, I mean, post COVID is both when this becomes legible as a phenomenon and really like all the transformations we're seeing with contemporary literature
Hmm.
from like book talk, like the sort of book talk slop takeover, and like the seeming omnipotence of a very specific like style of agent, the
Hmm.
squeakcore stuff we've talked about before. I mean, some of that was older, but it really became
Hmm.
universal. Um, and then also this and this sort of resurgence of, I mean, Discordia Review had an article about how reading itself has become fashionable again, but in a way that
Hmm.
is linked both positively and negatively to the reading people are doing on their phones, where,
Hmm.
like, either the book becomes like an auxiliary of an online subculture about books, or it becomes your mark of independence from online as a whole.
Hmm.
Um,
Which, ironically
anyway,
enough,
just
is
from
a
that first,
oh, I was about to
uh,
say, which ironically enough is a profile that can be made that is very much online. But that's an aside.
yes, Yeah, no, that is also important. And to go back to the list, like the elephant in the room on that list is these are also very gender books.
Mm-hmm.
And that corresponds to the extent to which, like, online, in the sense these books index and identify with mainstream social media apps, let's say, has become consumed by gender wars. And not even in the sense of like feminism in the early 2010s, say,
Mm-hmm.
which, I mean, also a phenomenon like supercharged by online. And I
Yes.
did make that like way back in 2013 when I was doing like a top 10 memes of 2013 for alt crit.
Mm-hmm.
Like I put like feminism as number one in a positive sense and
Mm-hmm.
was talking about like I was really like I was gung ho like this
Mm-hmm.
is our like Twitter revolution. This is our like Tahrir Square.
Oh
Um
yeah. I
that
yeah.
yeah.
I
um
was there. I was there
it's
too.
my 60 my May 68. Like but
Yeah.
the um the thing that um feminism in that moment was a political political movement, a political war, and to some extent a political war to not like literally abolish gender necessarily, although you had people
Mm-hmm.
talking about that,
Mm-hmm.
but like break its power over subjectivity. Like that was the
Mm-hmm.
goal, and the goal was to kind of like make gendered assumptions of subjectivity subordinate to political ones, even insofar as those political ones deal with gender. And
Mm-hmm.
what you have now in the sort of like femcel versus incel kind of like uh men are like this, women are like this kind of like and queers are like this, like
Mm-hmm.
third category, almost third gender, even though everyone simultaneously disavows that concept, and
Mm-hmm.
like um you get internal gender wars between like trans people, say.
Mm-hmm.
um like it is more like a return to this like war of the sexes, the way I first saw that term used in The White Goddess, when it's talking about like Holly Boy and Ivy Girl fighting at every like midwinter festival as this sort of like Punch and Judy thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like like this primordial eternal pre-conscious conflict.
Hmm. It's funny
But that
because
is
oh, I was
mhm.
I was about to say it's funny because the model seems to me, although admittedly there's just more familiarity with this sort of thing, where it's kind of more coming about, um, looking more like Joanna Russ's female man to me. But that's kind of an aside.
Okay, wait, elaborate on that because I am curious about
So I
what you
mean,
mean
like
there.
it. Namely, I'm thinking of the version of this kind of like tripartite, or as it like part type. I don't know how to like expand that out to four visions of this, but basically the idea of the female man being okay, here's like a woman in the contemporary time of the 70s or what have you is visited by all of these different versions of herself across time. At near kind of like the last third of the novel, she encounters someone, a version of her from the future, who is like actually unironically in a literalized war of the sexes, is a hardcore misandrist, although she also does keep lobotomized men as basically boy toys in every sense of the term, because she calls herself old-fashioned in that sort of version. And there's also a little bit of like turfdom involved in that, in a chapter which involves like basically someone who we would understand as a trans woman kind of encountering them and kind of the tensions involving that.
Yeah, I don't think anyone is really going that far with it.
Hmm,
Like heteropessimism and heterofatalism are kind of used interchangeably, and the assumption, as in like contemporary turfdom as opposed to 70s radical feminism, is in many cases like some version of trad gender roles is like it's really like, okay, what's the best compromise we can get?
hmm,
And even when a compromise is disavowed, there's not like, I mean, I would almost say that that sense of a future as radically different from the present is, in literary genre terms, really only possible when you enter on speculative fiction or like explicitly political fiction.
hmm.
And like saying these are very gendery novels, but gender has always been a very central preoccupation of the novel, hence like the marriage plot type
Hmm.
thing. And in to some extent, I think this trend coming now has to do with the way this hetero gender war takeover and territorialization of the possibilities of internet discourse, including internet gender discourse, has created an opening back onto like traditional concerns of literary realism. Like
Hmm.
Fuckboy, when I got to the end of Fuckboy and was thinking about how like everyone online hated it, but
Hmm.
part of that was that, like, it was getting all these accolades from like traditional literary institutions and other authors,
Hmm.
um, and everyone was like, "What the fuck? Why is this guy who came out of nowhere like getting all this instead of anyone who's been here?" Um,
Hmm.
and part of it was just, oh yeah, it basically ends on an argument for the family.
Hmm. Hmm. Interesting. I didn't quite. I mean, yeah.
I
It.
don't even mean the family in like the capital F Delaney sense, because it's not that like trad.
Yeah.
And I'm literally trying to download a PDF here to like just have in front of me to support my points.
Uh-huh.
But um it's like there is a very sort of like middle class novel settling down kind of
Yeah.
character to the end of it.
Yeah, it's definitely like it resolves in him actually instead of working precarious gig work, he finally gets kind of, he gets his big break in just getting like a steady job at a particularly steady company, helping out the community by being the vegetable guy. And in fact, one of the things that he comments on is like it feels good to be like called out as like the guy that everyone likes to see, like, oh hey, it's the vegetable guy kind of a thing. Like it kind of interfaces him with a community at that point, as opposed to him kind of
Yeah.
being this in this constant tension of always being ejected from a social sort of fabric, as a lot of the anecdotes that are in the novel can attest to. I'm thinking in particular of like
I think
the
he ends up in like a monogamous relationship instead of having like all the side bays. Um
kind of, yeah, or at least working towards that, because I forget if
yeah.
quote unquote X Bay and him get together again, but it's kind of like working towards that. Um,
Yeah. which is also the Sally Rooney format.
Yeah, that's another one that
I say this as a Sally Rooney like stand too.
yes.
Like,
Yeah, I'll admit that like you're repping for her and coming to her aid or her defense against like the seemingly ubiquitous, even when it's like weird for her to be a punching bag on certain regards. I even read like an article which I won't get into, which just kind of rehashes a lot of the usual negative points about publishing as it currently exists, and she suddenly comes up as like the object of scorn, with a line quote that like the highest aspiration authors have is a tote bag kind of thing, which like I mean I've got bad
it's
news
not
for
her aspiration. That's just what the publishers want to do.
exactly, and
There
also
is a very strong, like, mimetic rivalry thing to a lot of this discourse where, like, if somebody does get a big break, then everything they may want or try to do is going to be conflated with the forces that made that possible.
Also, like to kind of further the tote bag sort of thing, I got bad news for how like literature and like English departments and like English like school clubs conduct themselves, as evidenced by the literal tote bag that I have from my English department when I went to university. So like that aesthetic has been here for almost at least a decade by now. Like it's not a
Wasn't that a
new.
complaint of like one of the frog Twitter guys about like why they can't go to like normal bookstores?
And no, actually, it was like by this guy who like apparently went on like New Books Network to like talk about his Substack post. Apparently, like I think he's like the head editor of like the Republic of Letters, where like Dan Sinekin of all people got like an
Okay,
article
but
on.
I think there was some like frog Twitter guy who went viral for saying basically the same thing.
Oh, okay. Find this guy again. Let me see if I can find this guy again. Um, But anyways, I guess to also kind of complicate the narrative that we were talking about with like the upshot of Sean Thor Conroe being that like his main thing is like the family, because oh what else would this guy who literally came out of nowhere, what would he have to offer the sort of literary world, right? And I mean, like, one of the things I would say is firstly that he's less out of nowhere than people would think, given that allegedly, at least according to him, I don't know if I'd have access to be able to like look at the masthead for Tyrant magazine as the case was, but like apparently he was kind of seen as the chosen disciple of one Giancarlo di Trapano, of Tyrant
Right.
House, and was apparently put
And
as like
also kind of Sheila Heti. Like,
yeah.
I think the book ends even on like his character having like another one of the ending resolutions is his character having the like senpai noticed me moment with Sheila
Yes.
Heti.
Yeah, there is definitely that part. And also, if I can get a little bit into close reading territory here for a second, and it's kind of one of, for me, the key frustrating things about Fuckboy as a novel, kind of in retrospect, is that the entire novel, the upshot of the entire novel, kind of the thing that leads to the resolution, which I almost see as kind of more of a denouement than anything else, is essentially the fact that the book exists. Well, with like
Yes.
the lead up to kind of like everything else, and we've kind of discussed this elsewhere, but like at first, the character of Sean Thor Conroe, which is distinct from the author Sean Thor Conroe for question mark reasons other than just the basic Barthesian death of the author that texts would have. Is someone who is struggling trying to become this major novelist. He has this maximalist novel kind of draft that he sat on and kind of passed around to his buds, that was about this major trip across America that he had, kind of like a more maximalist version of On the Road by Jack Kerouac, although he doesn't necessarily say as much. but everyone kind of makes fun of it with like his, making fun of like, oh, like all of his long and, adjective filled sentences and things like that. After kind of struggling on and off with, quote unquote, Editor Bay, which is a whole other saga about this, he finally writes what we come to find was the novel that we've been reading the whole time, named Fuccboi, and we've been seeing kind of intermissions of the more novelistic form of that mixed in with the sort of day-to-day observations of one Sean Thor Conroe. But of course, within the text, it kind of winds up kind of neatly tying into the writing of a novel that is explicitly called out as being titled Fuccboi, which then
Which
leads to a major problem. And there's a couple of things that are points of friction with Sean Thor Conroe, the author, and how he's talked about the novel as like this manifestation of sincerity and vulnerability and things like that, and kind of like espousing it as this product of this hard work towards sincerity and vulnerability, which makes it really weird when, on a formal level, when you get down to it, what effectively seems to be the justification or the point, if we're to be reductive about this, of the novel is effectively the fact that the novel has been written and is published now, which is both a flattening of the sort of like postmodern autofictional sort of element of the author insert and things like that in a strange way that kind of it undercuts or undermines like what these sort of things can usually do to the sort of slippage between fiction and reality and things like that, speaking of telling stories and things like that. Although that's on a different valence of like telling stories as like telling lies and things like that, although that's kind of being a little cute about it. And not necessarily to cast aspersions necessarily on autofiction, and at least in that register. But also just like, if the whole point of the novel is effectively to exist in and of itself, then what does that mean for the creation of the novel as far as how anyone else is to care about it, if I'm making any sense so far?
yes, yeah, and I will also note that like this. I mean, what you're saying is almost like it's the literary equivalent of like the progression of a hustle or self-help guy,
Mm-hmm.
where like the proof that his method is like effective and changed his life is
Mm-hmm.
that he now has a like income making gig as a hustle self-help
Mm-hmm.
guy. He is now offering you a workshop for $70.
Mm-hmm.
It is kind of like that, I'll admit. But I also wanted to note that um, that element of the backstory does really account for the style and why it's like that. Because, like, in text almost, like, he gets made fun of for this like maximalist pretentious style and
Mm-hmm.
immediately like overcorrects or negative polarizes into writing like this like uh homestuck white rapper. um
Yeah. Which is made even
and
funnier by the recent news that our boy Sean Thor Conroe has now gotten a gig or a publication deal with none other than our common topic of recent off mic conversations, Dalkey Archive, wherein one of the sort of blurbs that is attached to the front matter of that book is comparing him to a Gen Z Faulkner. Again, a very popular American maximalist on that front. So
I
what
do in this case respect the hustle.
I
I
yeah,
gotta
you know
say
what? That is sort of the thing. I will not begrudge him the opportunity to say get like a speaking gig at like City Light bookstore, and get like major publication deals with like very storied presses. You know, it
And to get it for specifically the kind of thing that in the meta narrative of Fuckboy and in just like a basic market analysis of the literary scene would have been probably the hardest kind of thing to publish
Mhm.
as an up and coming like white guy creative writing class dropout, let's say.
Yeah.
I mean, ironically, you kind of still like I mean there is now this I mean, we were just talking about the um like sort of resurgence in these like maximalist books.
Hmm.
Um like now it's sort of becoming a thing again, but I think like when he was writing this, there was
Hmm.
the sense that like you were at like the nadir of appetite for that. Um,
Yeah.
and while we are talking about these categories that very much predate the internet in especially American literature,
Hmm.
and that if anything, I would hope the internet would be able to disrupt. Um,
Hmm.
like maximalism, minimalism, or like sincerity, like irony,
Hmm.
sincerity. Um, that is another big article that kind of gives us a frame for this was the Sam Kriss one
Hmm.
about was he framing it as alt lit
He
at this
was framing
point?
it as alt-lit, yes.
Yes.
Alt-lit 2.0, I believe he
Yeah.
explicitly called it out as
Um
such.
yes. And like while we're looping that discourse, it drives me crazy that um people have still not internalized the distinction David Foster Wallace made in A
Hmm.
Unibus Plurim between sincerity and authenticity.
Hmm.
Um, because yeah, I don't think that like Fuckboy is an incredibly it's certainly not an incredibly authentic novel, even if it is
Hmm.
literally autofictional. It is like in the sense of being just an unmediated expression of the natural self,
Hmm.
which isn't necessarily that interesting. It is a
Hmm.
very, very conscious, like, sort of satire of the self and
Hmm.
construction of the self. Um, And in that respect, insofar as it constructs that self for a reader, for an audience, to be communicable to that audience, in that respect, it is sincere. It is
Hmm.
sincere to the extent that it is not simply authentic, which is the inverse of Sam Kriss's critique.
Hmm.
Um, and now the kind potentially negative flip side of this is another assumption that has been made and being kind of hyperstitioned about internet literature is um, that it will tend to converge with autofiction and will tend to deal with the like the author as brand
Hmm.
um, will become inseparable from the book. The death of the author is reversed
Hmm.
insofar as, like, the author's brand becomes part of the work, and the work becomes part of the author's brand. And online, you are always building a personal brand. I remember like I mean, I first read that terminology in Christopher Lasch talking about like corporate culture in the 70s, and then
Hmm.
in Altlit 1.0 everyone was like using it positively in this like over identificatory way, um which I had never seen anyone do before.
Hmm.
um and it was kind of fun. It was kind of enjoyable, but also like the assumption of the stable, like consistent personal brand, as opposed to like fractured, fluctuating, anonymous identities, say.
Mm-hmm.
That's a very specific internet.
Yes. One that is being increasingly enforced as
Yes.
recent changes in legislation and infrastructure and certain massive kind of shifts in extra political power, let's say, with foreign interest groups, pressuring payment processors to force platforms, let's say, to ban content basically extra legally and seemingly arbitrarily, and that sort of thing. And of course, age verification law is becoming a major thing, and yeah, that's very much a dawn of a different type of internet than at least our generation has been used to up to this point. Which is increasingly invested in, at least I may end up poorly explaining this, but Hans-Georg Mueller's kind of conception of profilicity as a kind of new sort of social technology, let's call it, building off of, or building on top of the previous technologies, which originally was, which David Foster Wallace kind of talks about in more aesthetic terms, from what I understand, but is basing it off of Lionel Trilling's kind of more sociological, from what I understand, terms of sincerity and authenticity, namely profilicity, which is the idea that instead of being bound by kind of where you are, how you are expected to be within your position within society, which is sincerity, um, or being your authentic self, which obviously is authenticity. Like, the truer you are to a individuated self, the more authentic you are, and thus that is at least allegedly prized in various certain social organizations. We are now entering into an era of profilicity, which, according to Mueller, is basically the idea of you are instead judged by the second order signs in which you are surrounding yourself by. So, for example, the idea of who you are as a person is not determined by either who you are, as in, like, are you the second son of this particular family, in this particular sort of like social class or kind of profession or things like that, or how authentic you are as a person in the sort of this idealized romantic vision of the artist as a kind of fully self-actualized self, um, but rather, what kind of images do you have up on your Instagram grid?
In a way, doesn't the profile kind of run on authenticity and sincerity? Isn't that how people engage with that profile in a
It
sense?
runs on an image of authenticity specifically. It's a second order sign that is arranged from it. So it's not about like whether or not you actually are doing something, right? It's not about whether you are actually participating in, say, a particular ideological cause, or it's not about whether or not you actually live the sort of like upper class lifestyle that you're presenting on your Instagram feed, right? It's about merely appearing as such, or arranging such in a way that makes it look like the ideal that people strive for, including yourself in some regards, and then having that image of that affirmed by others. Now, I mean, this is kind of one of the part of the problem of profilicity is that it can again be mistakenly identified as authenticity, right? Like, um, someone making some major sort of change about their lifestyle, like, announcing a new job, or in the case of one such instance about actually Philosophy Tube, which was kind of Hans-Georg Mueller's kind of initial sort of example of profilicity in action, which kind of landed him in a little bit of hot water because of, the reasons you would expect about having that be kind of the object of analysis of Philosophy Tubes coming out as trans, right? The authenticity of her coming out as trans is less the important object insofar as Profilicity is concerned, but rather the affirmation of that through an announcement on her channel specifically. Like if it were just authenticity, the outward response, while, obviously it would be nice among, her friends and her colleagues and things like that, would be less important than the affirmation that is gotten in, say, the comments on her video talking about such, right? Which can be sort of understood partially as a misapprehension of, oh, well, this is an expression of a person's authentic self, when in reality, it's not so much the presentation of someone being authentic, or sorry, it is not the action of someone being authentic unto themselves, which would require, ideally, and or at least in some ideal cases, no such external affirmation on any sort of social media or anything like that. But instead, the recognition of, almost on a parasocial level, that sign, second order sign, that you are allegedly living your authentic self. Whether or not you are is kind of irrelevant to the sign. It's just the fact that the sign exists and in some way stands in for your authentic self, if I'm making any sense.
So I have a question for the both of you then. So how would you describe the terrain of the relationship between, let's say, not necessarily the self, but let's say the person and the media actors, whether that is like media actors as in like the observer, the person who interacts with the profile. How would you describe this kind of landscape? Because in a way, because in a way, there's a with the profile, right? There's like an interaction between I mean, for fuckboy, like the example being that that main guy is constantly, not constantly, but just very often taking into account how he appears to others, how he looks when he's in an elevator with lots of girls, so um, so would you say that the landscape of, let's say, the relationship of like I'm being seen by others, and what do I look like to others? Are there more questions that then become generated now that the internet exists? Now that profilicity is something to be considered.
Well, one of the interesting things about fuckboys, say, cultural politics compared to like Tulathimutte, who entirely kind of gives recognizable like culture war types, is that like the guy that is the perspective character is not so much like um woke or a chud as like um just characterized by being aware of like constantly being read as one or the other and ironizing it like compulsively. Like he sort of thinks of him, he is sort of like he has his like almost male feminist moments that like the way he's reconciling it as opposed to like Tulathamutte's feminist is just um like oh yeah, I'm like what are the chapter titles here I'm thinking of? Which incidentally, just the chapter titles, like Sus Boy, um, like MRA, Hetero Bro, Lil Bro, uh, like, and then like Flower Boy referencing like Tyler the Creator's queer turn at the end. Like it's just being like, okay, yeah, I see how this would map to this signifier, so I'm gonna like insert this signifier as a joke, but like really I'm just trying to live my own life.
Where does it show?
Actually, that is a very good definition of, I think, what makes a lot of these novels feel online, a lot
Hmm.
of these stories too feel online, even when they're not dealing that directly with the internet. Like, and as a potentially like a serious intervention in like theory of the novel problems going back to like Lukács and realism versus modernism, say, where realism deals, like social realism deals with these sort of social identifiers, and modernism tried to access some kind of like authentic, possibly to the point of incomprehensibility self.
Hmm.
And then these novels are defining their characters by their second order signs.
Hmm. Which,
And that is something that
I don't know,
mhm,
keep going.
that I think is historically maybe like necessary or unavoidable and potentially interesting.
Hmm.
Like it is something I try to do in. I mean, I've told the story. I think that like I was very isolated growing up when I was in a lit program in high school. I just like hyper fixated on style and learned how to like replicate every like modernist and pomo trick, but I had no
Hmm.
idea how to do like characters outside of sort of speculative settings that I made up myself, because like I wasn't getting that much social like information.
Hmm.
And I taught myself to do that by like being very online and
Hmm.
watching both how people presented themselves and how they interacted, and how those things like combined and contradicted.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah, that actually leads into what I was kind of going to mention, which, as I was kind of picking at, and as much as I try to in in reading these texts, bracket the idea of the author, because I do find the intrusion of, again, sort of reading the text back onto the author or vice versa, as seemingly entirely coterminous with one another, just like assuming increasingly that the Venn diagram is a circle in this inversion of the death of the author. I try to bracket that as much as possible because I find that to be uh, to my distaste at best, let's say. But
And same, and what I'm saying doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the author
mhm,
any more than like profilicity necessarily implies the single unified profile. In
mhm,
fact, I'd say one of the things that is lacking in a lot of this literature so far is the dialogic.
yeah,
And you can do so much, and the kinds of social dynamics I was observing, and the kinds of stories that I felt like I wanted to hear told with it
mhm,
would be very dialogic, would involve the overlapping of different registers and
mhm,
different like sets of second order signs. Whereas
mhm,
like certainly the altlit 2.0 mode of internet novel
mhm,
has been dominated by these monologic brands,
mhm,
where the author's brand kind of tends to absorb everything else in the story and in
mhm,
the text.
yeah. Which does make some of the fractures in at least the three main texts that we were initially talking about reading, which is to say Rejection, Fuckboy, and Paradise Logic. More so the first two than the third one. The third one is extremely just in whatever can be said of its voice, but we'll get to that when we get to that. Because at least in the format of Rejection, as a essentially short story anthology, it alleges to be the most like that, with how it's sort of the characters within each of the individual stories seem to relate to characters in other stories, uh, as well. But of course, the problem is that they're sort of siloed off into their individual
Yeah.
sort of instances, and then we only get the other side of the story when we get to, later on in other actual individual stories that are from their perspective.
I did this awkward sort of like beginning where I was talking about how the formal question of fiction in response to the internet has been kind of siphoned off into one, no, actually, it's a few kind of specific types of book or story.
Mhm.
And almost we're talking about, like, no, semantic syntactic doesn't really map here. But,
Hmm.
like, so the first one, which Fuckboy and, um, like, Paradise Logic are both kind of instances of, is the Altlit 2.0, where,
Mhm.
like, literally after the entire original scene, like, self-destructed because its, like, leading lights were rapists, which is admittedly not that unusual for a literary scene, and
Mhm.
it's more unusual for them to self-destruct over it.
Mhm.
Instead, just came back worse, like, half a decade
Mhm.
later, um, with, like, the
Including one of
leading
those leading
rapist
lights, no
literally still
less.
there. Like,
Yeah.
Talvin literally
Yes.
still there. Um, I I tried reading. Actually, I tried reading his Leave Society there for this, and it is so it's basically unusable because except as a sort of like self-negating example,
Hmm.
because he has rebranded so thoroughly as like an extremely offline guy and like cured his autism and
Through
whatever.
psychedelics, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, which and it still is very online in that like
Mhm.
it literally opens. He's just like he's annoying his parents with like esoteric health tips he's like picking up from like but at the same time it's just it's so extremely specific to I don't know, a particular performance of offlineness and
Mhm.
of like healthy healthy integration, which it really isn't. Like you can tell
Mhm.
immediately just from reading it isn't. But also like I couldn't keep going through it because it is actually the most boring book he's ever written, which is the opposite of the response that it got conventionally, where it's like, oh, and this is how it was set up to be like, oh,
Oh.
he's doing a conventional, like, plain old good novel this time.
Huh.
And, like, in the process of doing that, he eliminated everything that was interesting about his style, in the
Hmm.
sense that I defended it way back in 2013, where, like,
Mhm.
the weird little details that made up so much of the sort of alt-lit, where, like, yeah, of course the voice is flat and affectless because it wants you to focus on the details. All the details are, like, narratively significant, quote unquote, and boring as shit, and the style around them is just cardboard.
Mhm. God, that whole sort of like offlineness made me have the dark thought, and I haven't read any of his work, so I wouldn't know how applicable it would be. But I wonder how relevant Michelle Houellebecq would be to that whole kind of conversation. Because admittedly, he is kind of the new Talon as opposed to the old Talon. Is I feel like in sort of or spoken of in the same sort of circles that would talk about Michelle Houellebecq. Um, as like relevant to society and like speaking to the contemporary condition and things like that. Um, but that is a bit more of a tangent or orthogonal to the whole kind of thing.
Yeah.
Although
I
that,
mean, it's relevant. The point of relevance is that Houellebecq was a kind of proto young boy, as like
mm-hmm,
enfant terrible of the country of the young girl.
mm-hmm,
Um, and in that sense, he has become part of the canon for people who are writing as young boys,
gotcha.
which a part that I have like scrupulously avoided because he just seems like a shock jock. But
Yeah, that's a little bit of the impression I get as well from him. Um,
We now Holmes and I we talked about this like for a bit, but it does feel like in some sense the kind of authenticity for that or sincerity, if you want to put it that if you want to go there too, that the minimalism of alt lit brought sort of is starting to come to a point where it's like because it's there and it exists, it is therefore authentic or sincere in in some sense. Like it almost becomes like a terminating kind of conclusion. Like you don't really arrive at the authenticity or sincerity um, in a more like in a more circuitous kind of a circuitous way. It's more like this is what's written and this is what and it is authentic because it is there. Like in the way that some people might interpret, say the pros of Fuccboi, or even like Sam Pink for that matter, the kind of like like oh fuck you coat, like those kind of little interjections. People might find that like authentic because because of that kind of like thought structure. But at that point, it kind of like ends there. Like it's not really like authentic specific to the character, but more like authentic because it's there and it's in front of you.
I think
That
even though periodically, like, they'll go through a think piece cycle to like to gaslight you that it hasn't already been covered. Like this this style has become so standardized and ubiquitous that people aren't even using it necessarily because they think it is like especially authentic or sincere anymore. They use it for prophilic reasons because it marks the text as belonging to a certain kind of speaker and a certain kind of audience, as like it's a demographic marker. And other writing styles, other like house styles, are also that. Like squeakcore is that. The way like frankly, I could probably if I really wanted to like set myself an intensely autistic project, I could do like formal analyses of the style, like the prose style of any given like emergent book talk genre. Um, they're all sort like the style serves this kind of sociological function and is in a real way, and this is where almost we get back to the novelistic dialogic, is
mhm,
in a real way linked to the social conditions and like the social production, including online, of that like demographic and audience.
mhm.
Uh,
By the way, on that note, today I decided to take a look to kind of follow up on that claim. And
Uh-huh.
I'm just going to tell you right now, based on Sam Pink's claim that, like, oh well, he ripped off, the beginning of my novel Garbage Times, or novella Garbage Times rather. He formulated it in such a way where it's based off seasons, and my thing was based off seasons, et cetera, et cetera. I'm going to tell you right now, I took a look at the table of contents and the first page, and he's full of shit.
Ah.
So to go into specifics, because I literally have them side by side right now. I was looking at this before we got into this. Table of contents for Garbage Times by Sam Pink. January, March, June, September. Table of contents for Fuccboi. Winter, bunch of sub chapters. Spring, bunch of sub chapters. Summer, bunch of sub chapters. Fall, bunch of sub chapters. Winter, bunch of sub chapters. Spring, bunch of sub chapters. Summer, one sub chapter, because that's basically the end of the novel, kind of the upshot of that whole thing. First page, January of Sam Pink. January. It was a shitty winter. 17 people had died from the cold in Chicago. Temperatures well below zero or lots of snow. One person died when a 6-foot icicle broke off a building. Ha ha. Shit. I was freezing, on my way to work at a bar just west of downtown. I've been hatefully addressing my coat the whole walk to the train. Like, fuck you, coat, you are not good. I just hate you. The coat was ridiculous. I got it at the second-hand store. Think it was a hunting coat. Had duck pictures on the inside. It was the color of drug shit and half the buttons barely held. Useless. Useless. First time I wore it, I put my hands in the pockets and felt something and took out 2 handfuls of leaf dust. First page of Fuccboi. Winter. Postmate. December 2017. Got into a thing with a fresh grocer lady over coffee filters. It honestly wasn't a biggie, but why say they're on sale if they aren't, all I'm saying. She was like, this motherfucker. What aisle? I told her what aisle and we went and checked. Together. Well, we started to, but then she told me not to follow her when she noticed me following her. I was like, alright, for sure. Putting my hands up. Like, I'll hold it down. Man the reg. When she came back and said, no duh, they ain't on sale, I snapped. That's why I'd come with, I said, to show you they are. So we checked, actually together this time. She hemming and hawing the whole way, and so on it goes. So, like, only in the most generic sense could this possibly ever be said to influence each other. And, like, I'm sorry, but structuring a novel off of the seasons, that thing the entirety of existence has had to do since seasons exist, is not exactly a
Yeah.
Sam Pink original. So, like, yeah, no, that's there. I have a whole theory about that whole thing of, like, Sean Thor Conroe's deal sort of tipping the hand of the performance of Sincerity, that, like, Sam Pink was kind of doing a more kind of a stranger version, that, at least from a quick look at his Twitter profile, before, like, as that whole controversy was going down, I would sort of summarize as like a noble savage theory of the redneck kind of thing. But that's a whole
Yeah.
other sort of matter on that, and perhaps I'm already getting into gossiping too much for our sakes. But yeah.
Well, that is very much like, well, that is the voice of Fuccboi, and
Mhm.
Fuccboi is a voicey novel, and which is the buzzword now in publishing, and, like, that is inextricable from the conversation about it, especially also from the controversy in that, like,
Mhm.
50% of audience reaction is just going to be like, this voice is obnoxious.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
but it is clearly doing that on purpose, and to what extent it is doing that on purpose is also this kind of discourse smokescreen, because, like, you can pull up, like, posts from his Reddit account when he's, like, arguing about the book,
Mhm.
and he's talking like that. Um,
Mhm.
and then you see him now, and he's sort of going on, like, he has a more respectable kind of online presence now, but
Mhm.
um in this kind of, like, trying to be the Joe Rogan of lit kind of way. Um he does have a podcast too.
Yeah, yeah, he
I
does.
found it in the context of they were covering a book about like I think they were covering Holy Blood, Holy Grail.
Huh. That's an interesting pull.
Yeah. And they didn't have a lot to say about it. It was kind of just like, I mean, they were sort of, again, it was like Joe Rogan, like, wow, it's crazy that somebody thinks this, not in
Uh-huh.
like, but maybe it's true kind of thing.
Uh-huh.
But, um, like, I don't know, there could be more to it because, again, this voice is clearly a bit of a put on.
Hmm.
And even in the novel, you can tell it is a put on for the character in the novel. And insofar as you were saying, it's like Noble Savage theory of the redneck.
Hmm.
That's close, but the subject position of the novel, the quote unquote fuckboy, which is he doesn't spend even like all that much time online in the novel, but it is
Hmm.
a very online inflected, arguably like proto manosphere inflected combination of a bunch of things. Part of that is like rurality, lower class white masculinity, except he's not actually like lower class. Like
Hmm.
I'd say the character in the novel is like just the same kind of middle class that a narrator of a standard literary novel would be. And when it gets into the family stuff, it's like this is very much stuff that would be in a standard literary fiction novel.
Hmm.
What separates it from this is the character affecting this voice the whole time, which is a combination of like white redneck and like black rap masculinity and like first Trump term brain rot
Hmm.
and kind of like Bukowskian staccato.
Hmm.
Um, and the stylistic debt ostensibly to Sam Pink is basically
Hmm.
just alt-lit voice,
Hmm.
and it's a particular, I guess, like within alt-lit voice. You can distinguish Sam Pink voice a bit by some of these class markers.
Hmm.
It's not like Taolin writing like he's taking memos in a Gawker office. It
Yeah.
is like this towny kind of voice.
Hmm. It's from what
But
admittedly,
again, Conroe's putting it on in such an over the top way
right.
that like it almost sounds like if your only reference point for this was Sam Pink, you could almost read it like it's making fun of, which also I don't think is what's going on.
Yeah, no. Like, at least to me, what scanned in Sean Thor Conroe's case is that kind of, for lack of a better term, and he goes somewhere in the novel on like the laundry list of various forms of slang that he learned from various places that at least the character of Sean Thor Conroe grew up in. I don't know if that's applicable to the author, which that's a whole other can of worms there, which we'll put a pin in for a second. Um, but it's much more about various forms of urban culture, with the class kind of being what used to be called the precariat, or at least was kind of being bandied about as the precariat class, of
Yeah.
downwardly mobile middle class. Whereas Sam Pink, what kind of strikes me about Sam Pink is yes, those class markers, specifically of like lower class, typically like white demographics, oftentimes probably in like the Midwest to the South, but trying to kind of make beautiful sentences or images out of that kind of milieu. Hence the that sort of, specifically in Sam Pink's case, noble savage theory of the redneck, which yeah. Um, is that kind of
I
whole
will
thing.
stake my claim here, my contrarian claim here, although it will
Mhm.
be harder because I do not have the book in front of me because I read it while loitering in bookstores, which is a fairly fuckboy way of reading the book, as it were.
One thing Holmes and I did talk about was that what's interesting about while Sean Thor Conroe didn't copy Sam Pink so directly, I feel like the intent is basically the same in some sense stylistically, and
Mm.
also they have very maligned images of like a particular kind of culture. Like I believe from what Holmes told me, Sam Pink has this particular kind of folksiness to the way that um, that is kind of like worlds and situations are portrayed, and that folksiness kind of like inflects the sort of authenticity to it. Whereas, or authenticity, sincerity, uh, kind of a similar gesture to things like, say, Ocean Vuong's, uh, vo- fuck, why can't I remember the book's name? The first one. Uh, On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, like, the way that he kind of like reminisces about his hometown despite all the problems in it. Um, Whereas with Fuckboy, instead of the folksiness, it trades it for a rap and hip hop like inflected kind of gaze, and the way that that kind of colors the language becomes becomes its point of authenticity because supposedly people speak that way, which I remember baroquespiral you mentioned in an anecdote. This can be cut by the way if it's too like if it's too
Nah, I
personal. But
don't
just like
think so. If
the
it's what
anecdote
you
that you
remember.
said, no, the anecdote you said that there are people in your program that literally talk the same way.
In my previous programs, not even like my current one, because my current one is like PhD theory and criticism. That's like an extremely specific like theory nerd. But I mean like in creative writing and liberal arts undergrad. Like um yeah, this is definitely a recognizable type of guy. And even in relation to the folksiness, like again, the actual character in Fuckboy is suburban, but like suburban moved to the city, but like um people out like just even just as a generational like thing, like people out in the country talk like this now.
Mhm.
um Rap being another like aesthetic reference that it like
Mhm.
talks about itself. I'm trying to find the passage. There is also like Lil B hagiography, which is
Uh-huh.
um funny as both like a throwback to Rog and Buck and to the original sense of the word based.
Yeah.
But yeah, like specifically, and again, like rap had this thing where I mean, rap had I'd say a position relative to literature similar to like anime in some ways, where it's like a
Mhm.
thing you can be into for the same reasons you're into literature, but is more relatable to your peers.
Mhm. And it is both like something that has, or at least later on, got sort of institutional kind of acknowledgement, both in the more immediately obvious ways of, say, anthologizing rap verse into, books that are more to present the poetry of that with, which is a contested category of rap's relation to poetry, obviously. Um, but even in this sort of like, pitchfork sphere of, we've kind of joked, or at least I've kind of joked about, the more like international art English kind of approach to hip hop and, popular culture with, the onset of like poptimism and things like that. Um, Although hip hop does seem to be at least a little bit more, the object of such kind of kind of elaborations as the character of Sean Thor Conroe, somewhat how do I want to phrase this? Somewhat dubiously applies in, like you said, the hagiography of Little B. Um, I'm not entirely sure, although maybe I'm wrong, that Little B was exactly like introducing queer theory to the streets by calling himself a pretty bitch, but maybe I'm
Yeah.
failing to misunderstand. Maybe I'm failing to understand something about that moment. Especially considering that my only time that I heard of Lil B was from like the kind of Anthony Fantano set. So and Mew. So I don't know, man. I don't know what to tell you.
Reminds me of when Young Thug, like, okay, here's another example of that exact. Um, I actually, there's several things I could say, but actually, I'm just gonna first off say it's funny to think of David Foster Wallace as like a really early instance of this with his terrible rap book.
Oh yeah, I've heard vaguely about that. Which I
It's like it's mimetic. It's kind of inevitable. Like you
uh-huh.
have this poetic tradition, like a real like oral poetic tradition,
Mm-hmm.
especially at the moment of like the complete collapse and decline of poetry as a
Mm-hmm.
formerly like constitutive like partner or rival for prose.
Mm-hmm.
Um, just emerging, getting coded socially differently, emerging from black people, very, very like resisting canonization periodically, even as it happens, because as soon as, much like online, as soon as something becomes too canonized in the white establishment in hip hop, it gets like it becomes cringe. So you
Mm-hmm.
have like when I was in undergrad meeting these types of guys, I would hear like I heard like verbatim. I distinctly remember at different parties hearing like on one hand a like all these money rappers are corporate shills and the real stuff is conscious rap,
Mm-hmm.
white guy,
Mm-hmm.
and then a no, like southern trap is actually Marxist because it reflects like the economic reality of the streets. Like,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Yeah, I feel like I
or
must have.
Young Thug, where like
Yeah.
as a bit of a like there was this whole like Young Thug got the sort of queering rap credit
Mm-hmm.
like even more than Lil B, and then kind of I almost want to say I'm like might have been negatively polarized in a kind of like sad way because
Hmm.
like he was just doing that shit on like completely personal rules, like just
Mm-hmm.
completely personal. um then it got interpolated into a discourse by all these
Hmm.
like pitchfork and stuff, and then he has to explain to his homies like the newspapers saying I'm gay, but like I'm not. That's not what this is.
Hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was about to say that, like, I mean, I would give Young Thug a lot more. That's has more credence to that, but yeah, like you're saying, that's not been a straightforward reading by any stretch of the imagination, or at least an unproblematic
But again, it doesn't
reading.
have to. I like there is
Mm,
a real like okay, Afro-pessimism like
mm,
had a
mm-hmm,
whole thing about I'm forgetting which Afro-pessimist specifically, um about like the black body being sort of pre-queered in that it isn't like mapped to gender in the same way, and like the
hmm,
whole like rap fashion thing is you get to perform masculinity in like ostentatious ways that would probably not even be read as strictly straight in white culture, while simultaneously being perceived as like threateningly hypermasculine.
Hmm.
Um, but then again, like, to come out in the discourse and say this then interpolates it in a way that, like, will read into other discourses, like the fucking buck breaking thing, because,
Yeah, that
like, yeah,
given that the entire novel of Fuckboy is effectively like almost neurotically obsessed with the question of masculinity and the various factors which determine that masculinity, would kind of try and cathect through the figure of Lil B with all of what we just said in mind.
yes,
Um,
yes. No, it is it is a making illegible of his own masculinity, I think, because he admires that illegibility in somebody like Lil B.
mhm. Also, yeah, this is more a complete aside. I'm pretty sure I've said this elsewhere, but I do find it you kind of on the note of like the lyric tradition, as sort of reincarnated in hip hop. I do find it very funny that I want to say I keep forgetting the actual university, but Jorge Luis Borges gave a series of seminars on like the meaning of poetry and things like that, which of course he wonderfully problematizes and kind of leads down the various labyrinths of it as he's wont to do. And then he kind of ends this series of seminars on a statement that says, I believe that the world, or maybe not ends the seminars, but he does kind of give an aside that says, I believe the world is ready for a return to the lyric of the form of poetry set to music, and I believe that the setting for this will come in America. Cue a few years later, and suddenly this thing called hip hop emerges in New York.
Yeah. Or just to add some of the material I was thinking about style in Fuckboy, some of the defense I have of that,
Hmm.
because I think that is a genuinely, like, interesting way of looking at how to do that sort of online flavored minimalism in a way that is not just like unmediated, one might say. Like,
Hmm.
it uses I was actually going I need this soundbite. Like, the thing that uh I feel like, of all the, like, minimalist authors that I've read, the closest comparison for how Fuckboy is written, who also happens to be among my favorite minimalist stylists, is Nishio Ishin.
Hmm.
Um, and the way Nishio Ishin writes is also, I do this to an extent in Shut in Dark Lord, although I vary the thought lengths more. Because Nishio Ishin does this kind. It's also similar to, say, visual novel prose, where
Hmm.
the expectation, like the structure of how you read the prose, is like refreshing line by line, and
Hmm.
gives you, even if the lines are long or dense, like, which they often aren't,
Hmm.
this very distinct sense of, like, real time stream of consciousness with a beat or a pulse or a metronome. So
Hmm.
the structure will just be like a thought or an action or a basic description, and then, like, another line, a thought that follows it, another line, a thought that follows it, and you get this sense of, like, the generative rhythm of thoughts.
Hmm.
Um, which is a very deliberately artificial, like, no one blogs or tweets that way, say.
Hmm.
Like, it is a way of reproducing, like, the kinds of thoughts that maybe go into a tweet. Like, that literally, like, the way I tweet, and part of the reason I'm still attached to these stupid fucking microblogging platforms, like, even though they're all psyops,
Hmm.
is that, like, I'm doing a sort of internal dialogue, and it is very dialogic. there is almost a kind of comedy improv character to it, where it's like the thought the last thought generates the next thought, generates the next thought, and may end up somewhere completely different than it started. And if like one of those thoughts just has a particularly like elegant zinger form, independent of whether I can like coalesce the whole chain into a structure, I'll just be like that one and put it out there and see how people respond to it. But this is very much about like also building up the total structures, and the way it's like literally the way it's formatted on page, almost every line is one sentence. Like the length of the sentence varies the length of the line, not so much the number of sentences. Very occasionally there's multiple. Again, this is almost exactly how Nishio Ishin writes. Many of them are very, very short, and then some of them lengthen, and then go to short ones again, as these sort of like list ways of building things up. And there's like just like maybe 20 lines or something of like a unit of that, and then there's another unit. And what you start to notice is that this is just like, it is a differently broken up paragraph. And if you wrote it down as a paragraph, it would be like conventionally good literary writing. Like if you just let the sentences flow directly one to the other, which would still be pretty choppy, which would still be like look like a bunch of texts or a green text or whatever it looks like on the page.
Mm-hmm.
It's like it would just flow like upper middle brow kind of in a good way. But then it has this like because it's broken down and it like deconstructed this way,
Mm-hmm.
you can see like how that sort of style would form as like monologue.
Mm-hmm.
It's also
To be
making me think
fair,
of how
isn't that
when yeah
isn't that kind of what early Tao Lin sort of does? I mean,
yes
what you're describing isn't that kind of just kind of like an associative line? Like
yes
basically, you would lead into something like, "Oh, I ate Cheerios this morning. Cheerios reminds me of I don't know, reminds me of the desert. The desert has lots of holes in it. One time I read a book about a guy who was digging holes all day.
See, Talon is way quirkier in the selection of details. It is the same method, but like the way the details are selected, and again, it's voice. Like Talon has a different voice than this guy. Sam Pink has a different voice, and Talon's like associative chains are very at the era we're talking about. EEE, they're very like Adventure Time associative chains. Uh, it's like just on the tail end of like twee hipster era, really. Like all of Altlit 1.0 was. Um,
So where has that style then gone since? I mean, like it's sort of become such a standard that now it's almost like just to go back, reiterate earlier, just what I mean by negative space, I mean by like by like subtext, just for clarification.
mhm.
But anyway, I guess on that front, I guess then with the kind of clipped sort of style that or not so much clipped but minimalist style that alt-lit had brought, relying mostly on subtext to bring these details. I mean, if anything, like the one thing I would disagree on is just that I wouldn't say that Tao Lin's like prose is affectless per se, because the prose isn't
It's
exactly
not.
what's causing the affect. It's the actual
Yes.
structure itself, which is what you're saying. But I think I guess what I want to gesture at is is that how that sort of minimal style sort of became something that lends itself to the profile, so kind of having these
Yes.
clipped sort of stylistic thoughts or stylistic kind of observations that then make up not a person specifically, but rather a kind of person, a
Yeah.
kind of database person, if you will, about
Hmm.
like
Hmm.
oh, like what is like the feminist, like, oh, what is this, like, male feminist who's actually, not that much of a feminist is like, or what is someone who's ruining their life over or either just like a database of just people who haven't had good relationships or don't know how to, or having a hard time kind of like, you know coping with relationships that don't materialize.
Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, I think like ironically in the idea of this being a vulnerable kind of novel or a sincere kind of novel is in fact how the character of Sean Thor Conroe is obsessed with posture and with how he conducts himself and with how he dresses, signaling something. So, like, there's instances, for example, where he's, doing a delivery to a hotel, right? And he very consciously mentions, like, how he positions himself in the elevator in contrast to the two women that were also in the elevator so that he doesn't convey himself as a predator effectively, right? Or instances where he goes to a party and he's dressed in like, a champion hoodie and sweats and like a beanie. And he's like basically thinking like, oh man, I'm like really giving like chud right now, kind of a thing. So even though he's like walking in, because I believe this is at the point where like his hips were broken, and so he has to like walk around with a cane, but he still is obsessed with his dress as a signal of who he must be as a person, even though it has nothing to do with ultimately. Um, so there are these weird fractures of recognizing there is a dialogue that is happening, or at least an obsession with the second order sign as kind of a proxy for that. But because of the formal constraints of how these are designed, it can only be like the gesture that such a dialogue exists. Because I mean, like, I was also thinking even in Fuckboy, where like there are several instances where he gets into arguments with other people, right, about like various stupid things he's
Yes.
saying. But that's like
I'm not
again,
talking about the dialogic as like dialogue as a whole.
right?
Clearly, that happens in all of these
Yeah.
stories, and other characters exist. But like, this is, I mean, the examples you're giving are like good examples of like narcissism
Hmm.
cannot work without an other.
Right.
Like, narcissism is actually an obsession with the presentation of the self towards others and its affirmation by others. And then the
Hmm.
problem being that it can't see those others except as the ones who give or withhold approval, the sort of the who give or withhold approval to the self. And all these instances you're giving, and there are other fairly well defined characters
Hmm.
throughout Fuckboy, but all these examples are a bunch of little characters, a bunch of little others adding up to a big other who he is constantly negotiating his identity with.
Hmm.
Um, and none of those in the sense of second order signs. Like, on one hand, those little others can always be identified and placed in the matrix of the the social mesh by their second order signs, but then they are reduced to those signs, whereas the self manipulates and constructs with those signs, and you don't get a sense I don't think with really anybody else in Fuccboi, actually, of, like, the depth and complexity of an other's relationship to their own second order signification that you get with the protagonist.
To the point of actually, like, to the point of uh, absolute being rendered pathetic. I'm thinking in particular the rather horrible sequence where he goes and meets quote unquote ex Bay's girlfriend. And then just without even intending, just starts just vomiting up just every single stereotypical thing that you should not be saying to someone in that position, almost compulsively.
Which is, again, this is the subject form, the default subject form. And to observe this while stepping outside it would be an impressive literary achievement of based mainstream social media platforms, where the inverse of the profile, let's say, of Profilicity, is the scroll. You are a profile, and you can scroll your own profile, like, all the way back to fucking 2016 if you want, and, like, add up all these signs and average all these signs into a complex person, and that's one page. And then everyone else is the scroll, where you're scrolling your feed of your curated social environment and seeing bits and pieces of signifiers from different people, all adding up and averaging out into a sense of the, like, impersonal big other society that you are either integrating into or at war with at all times, and to some extent into subcategories, where you notice similar types of posts across a demographic, and it is like that demographic is speaking to you, not an individual person. Like, that is, I would say, really how a lot of the sort of reactionary dimension of internet subjectivity gets going.
Absolutely.
Um,
Yeah, it's also kind of thinking about, maybe this is taking it into a bit of a side, but even on like the textual level, I can get a bit semiotic here for a second. This kind of collapse of others signifiers even kind of represents itself in how the novel Fuckboy is written. Because like the thing that stood out for me, because I was obviously prepared to, roll my eyes at the slang, because everyone rolls their eyes at the slang, right? Which, I mean, that's, we can talk about that maybe, but that's, I feel, less relevant than the other sort of linguistic quirk that shows up, which is the shortening of certain words into leet speak, weirdly enough, which is very odd, for example, in collapsing, say, the word you into the letter U, or, be right back into BRB, as like these
it's kind of
signs.
an old Roggenbuckism.
Huh. I'm less familiar with Rogan Buck, admittedly. But like to me, it sort of struck out as like it's very weird to have a word in this text, which its only function, semiotically speaking, is to refer to the word that it's supposed to represent, and only that word, right? That kind of keeps being peppered throughout this text. So like the only function that even the text itself sometimes forms, not just the book as a whole, but the text sometimes, is just to refer to itself over and over again, in weird different gestures.
Like, do we want to talk about any of the others? Because I think the thing we're talking about now with Profilicity and feedicity, like, that does filter through like that's relevant to
That
both of these.
Yeah,
Um,
that's rejection almost in a nutshell to ad nauseum.
right.
Um, Phew, what can I say about rejection? I mean, firstly, I will signal that I could not bring myself to technically finish it, although I did read as much as I could stand all the way to the end, which is speaking of the whole thing about author intent, I do have some almost conspiratorial readings of the very end of that collection, which is effectively
Okay, that
the fictionalized rejection letter of the text itself. Again, sort of these texts that want to terminate into being about the text themselves, although rejection just by its content at least resists that, which makes the end much more um, aggressive and kind of irksome, but that's a bit of an aside, which we'll get to later. Um, so I did not finish what was it like Real Cool World and main character. Um our Dope Future, sorry, and main character. Those I did not even start our Dope Future, and for personal reasons I could not get through main character just at all. But everything else I did read front to back. Um and yes, it's the thing about this is that it's kind of weird, right? And I was kind of talking to caraparcel the other day about this because it brings up another sort of problem with a lot of these uh discourses of internet literature, right? Is the question of what is it to be terminally online, right? Because a lot of these characters that are in this collection of short stories, which for those of you who have not encountered this, um, the first one most infamously as a prime example and the crown jewel of sorts in a lot of ways of discourse fiction, and Tony Tulathimutte is kind of throwing his hat in the ring of discourse fiction, which Gabe, I'm sure you have something to say about this,
yeah.
is The Feminist, which is a story about a guy who is positioning himself as a male feminist, whose various contradictions in his own social world and lack of sexual success, um, in in a way that the summary gives more cohesion than the actual story, turns him into an incel and eventually, finally, into a mass shooter as a result of the kind of ideological becoming online that he throws himself down into as a result of various of lack of successes and rebuffs that he encounters. Um, Followed shortly by a short story called Pix, which is about someone who actually encounters the feminist in a couple of ways, and allegedly is kind of the one who brings down the main character of Our Dope Future, who is basically a woman who is various bundles of resentment, falling into absolute shambles over a one night stand with her best friend, who basically kind of helped her out when she was going through an eating disorder, and then eventually just like falling to pieces after he ends up rejecting her further advances or her trying to form more of a serious relationship in the wake of that, and him moving on, getting a girlfriend, and eventually marrying that woman. While she's just kind of sitting there stewing about all the various ways in which she has been sort of rejected. In case it isn't obvious from the title, rejection is the main theme of the collection. And in fact, Tony Tulathimutte in various interviews has said that this was an attempt at a sort of philosophical study of rejection throughout these stories in question. And there were apparently some nonfiction and bits and essays that were left on the cutting room floor of this, but again, that's a bit of an aside. Which culminates in, which back to the story, culminates in the main character's name is Allison, basically left alone with a crow, which she bought at one point in the story, completely numb, as a result of her absolute kind of abjection that she puts herself through in various rants with another key component of that, which is this group of friends from work who kind of cheerlead and then ultimately throw her into the garbage bin, so to speak, in response to her various mood swings and reactions to various goings on. This is then followed by the first encounter that I had with this short story collection, which caraparcel actually read this off to me, or at least a very key part, which we'll probably get to, which is Ahegal, or The Ballad of Sexual Repression, which stars a... it's not... oh god, I forget the ethnicity of his character. Variety of Southeast Asian. I want to say Thailand, like Thai. Am I correct in that?
Are we talking about Tony Tulathimutte or the
The characters, although I believe they share the same
character?
ethnicity.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, Thai.
Thai. Okay, cool. So basically a Thai man who comes out as gay after a lifetime of basically being the butt of everyone's jokes, just complete wallflower, doormat, insert, passive, bullied subject term here. And then finally kind of trying to come to terms with that. But the thing is, and this kind of ties into him being, in the games industry, which is rather awkwardly implemented, but we'll get to that when we get to that. When he finally does actually come out and start, playing the field, meets up with a hunk at the gym on Grinder, and kind of encounters the various social contradictions of that sort of scene. But the problem that he comes to is that he has a sadistic streak, our main character, which is informed by hentai, specifically the ahegao facial expression, which has now mimetically entered the database of pornography in general, which then terminates in...
A very straight hentai trope. Like, you don't
Yes.
really see that in yaoi.
Yeah, that's the other weird thing. That's like, how did this become like a thing in like this particular
Admittedly, it almost makes me wonder if literally he wanted to make a story about a straight hentai gooner and then
uh-huh.
figured it would be like too like one-sidedly alienating, and so like made him gay for plausible deniability woke points.
Maybe, but like, I mean, for one, that kind of leads a little too into something that he even addresses in the fictionalized rejection letter. And also, like, his kind of awkward, like, mishandling of various types of guy is something that's evident in the
Yeah.
feminist, where he admits he stitched together the two types of the incel mass shooter and the male feminist and just sort of smushed them into one guy. And in the story, you can see practically like the welding line, so to speak, where suddenly he flips from one to the other without really an adequate explanation of how he collapsed into being that being. But that's kind of an aside. To kind of complete the description of the contents, or tried to summarize it because I realized I've been rambling a little too long. Anyways, that relationship unfortunately ends poorly because Kant eventually tries to kind of fulfill his sexual fantasy. Unfortunately, the boyfriend makes a mistake of admittedly trying to play it off with regards to Kant's manhood, and tries to play it off as no big deal, but that kind of kills the relationship right then and there when his boyfriend tries to kind of get him to open up. And then eventually Kant just kind of seals himself off in this like hermetic bubble of like making commissions to various porn stars, which, my God, we'll get into the commission, maybe, because that I can only summarize the commission as a Rick and Morty sketch, but that's an aside. And then just kind of isolating himself off as only ever achieving his desires in this sort of secondhand proxy, because reality cannot provide him that sort of libidinal satisfaction. And then we get into Our Dope Future, which, from what I understand, is a story about the exact opposite kind of person, just absolute, social success, who may or may not have, if I understand correctly, basically be participating in sexual trafficking, and then get arrested as a result of that. I don't quote me on that, because again, I did not read it, because I took one look at the first page and immediately went, I know I'm going to find this insufferable, so goodbye. And then I moved on to main character, who is possibly about a character that was showing up several times over, named B, who is a non-binary Thai person, who is allegedly Kant's cousin, and also the person that we find out the male feminist of the feminist name is Craig. Basically, someone who I believe Angie on the server referred to as like B, kind of keeping Craig on as sort of a personal lol cow. And then, that kind of leads to a conflict there. But what happens in main character is that it's in the framing, admittedly, of potentially the most interesting formal conceit of the whole thing, speaking of my formal sort of concentration on this, of a Google document that is compiling itself in a bit of a lolcow formulation. A compilation of documents related to what they refer to as Botgate, which is effectively the discovery that there was this one person that seems to have posted this massive screed, kind of like almost like a self call-out post of sorts. But then we come to find that this person also is responsible for like forming all of these different bots that have been on various social media platforms, who have been pumping out effectively these scissor statements and smoking guns for these various flashpoints of discourse for years.
But yeah, so that Altlit 2.0, that's
Yes.
like one of the conflated internet lit subgenres. The other is like discourse fiction. And in some sense, discourse fiction appears to respond to, again, the problem I was posing of the dialogic and the initial problem of representing the new online types of guys, where like where the Altlit 2.0, like the author and the brand and the character are like all the sort of second order signs are clustered around this one orienting self, which is being constructed as a brand through the book and through the social media production and discourse production around the book. In the discourse novel, like the discourse production is pre-existing. It is using ideas that are like, that is where you get the second order signifying field in which the characters are articulated, is existing online discourse, and the author selects specific types of guys legible in this discourse and lets them interact or causes them to interact. And then the, to some extent, intended outcome is to feed this back into the discourse and let people argue about the sort of the narrative they just witnessed featuring their sort of familiar characters. And like, so the classic, the example that really just created this as a genre, I think, was probably Cat Person, which was a short story that many people read as a think piece, both
Mm-hmm.
because like it was written in this voice that like could have been confessional, and it was a kind of story that it was common to have like confessional stories about, and because it was written in so much of like the register of think pieces and roughly the same length and format, and like this is a form that lends itself as much, at least as much, to the short story as the novel. Hence, Tulathimutte doing this. Although I would
Mm-hmm.
say there are also a lot of novels, and if we do say another Asian diaspora lit
Mm-hmm.
episode, a lot of things that are currently like big in that field, like R.F. Kuang's Yellowface,
Uh-huh.
are functionally discourse novels.
Yes.
Um, So, and yeah, where Altlit 2.0 tends to be on the slightly on the chuddy side of the discourse, but with some plausible deniability, discourse fiction can lean more towards the woke side of the disc. And again, it's like you can get this like extents of this through almost anything. Like I was reading a like it is now very common to, when you have characters who are representing some sort of outgroup relative to your protagonist in even say like a regular genre thing,
Mm-hmm.
they will be represented in a way that reads a lot like this.
Mm-hmm.
But the flip side is that the discourse fiction can be ambiguous. Like people
Mm-hmm.
will argue about it, and it's not like purely didactic in the way that like political fiction of the high 2010s maybe aspired to be. It is it is intended to reproduce with some sort of a twist, which it may or may not achieve, the
Mm-hmm.
discourse that it is responding to. Um, and where one could say that the Altlit 2.0 is dominated by profilicity, the discourse story is dominated by the perspective of the feed. You are the anonymous spectator.
Mm-hmm.
These characters are in your feed having drama.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which definitely lends itself to a lot of the frustration that I had reading this all the way through, at least as much as I could stand reading this, with the exception of the two end bits, which are frustrating for different reasons. Which kind of gets us a little bit into kind of the main frustration in the meta discourse of what internet literature is in general, which, while not necessarily overtly spoken of, is kind of embedded in what Blake Butler is kind of pointing out as like because there is no systems novel that can adequately address this sort of thing, that means therefore there is either no internet novel of our times or there is no great internet novel of our times, which may be the actual object of everyone's concern. Um, or moreover, that what exists is just purely annoying or not really getting it, is this kind of sense of the abdication of the duty of the writer to do something like what Gustave Flaubert did with Madame Bovary, right? This sense that I saw in an essay kind of talking about this, of the notion of like speaking to or speaking on or about the character in a way that shows that the novel knows the character and can articulate the character better and more beautifully than the character can depict and articulate themselves. Um, I forget the exact line that was discussed, but like I think it was about Madame Bovary talking about being, ironically enough, rejected by her sort of lover that she's having an affair with, and it being described something along the lines of like, you know, her heart being this sort of windswept ruin of a church at midday or something like that. I forget the exact line, so forgive me for butchering this. But basically, that line itself was a beautiful depiction of the desolation that she felt. That if Madame Bovary were asked to try to describe it, she never could have arrived at those terms. Um,
Hmm.
and this kind of showcases, and this is part of, Flaubert's kind of metaphysics of the idea of that infamous line of the author must be a god, must be like a god, present everywhere and seen nowhere, as this kind of idea of one who sort of arranges everything, but whose presence is not actually seen or felt. It's just kind of, basically it almost the way of the idea of God as a watchmaker the novelist is to the novel, in a very real sense. Although I think Flaubert himself may object metaphysically to that comparison. Um, Whereas with examples like Tulathimutte and Rejection, right, there is very much this sense, and it's even backed up by certain reviewers commenting that, they're amazed at how much fun that they are having reading these fucking losers. And my own sort of reaction that I posited of like, why does it feel like I'm expected to react to this like I'm supposed to react to an episode of TMZ? That the purpose
Or
of
an episode of like H Bomber Guy or Mr. Meataker.
yes, especially that
The
actually.
culture war opposed examples of people who
Mhm.
literally came from the same lolcow site.
Yes. Oh my God, yes. Where yeah, like basically because there is a sense, although there is this half-assed measure throughout of kind of explaining the social mechanisms that led to this. Although again, and if we want to get into the in-depth individual instances, I have plenty of individual objections to this or points where this shows where there's just like the gesture of alluding to, oh well, you see, this is why this person wound up being this way, but it's kind of an explanation by not explaining anything. And so instead we're left with just the caricature, the sort of pebble thrown at you from your feed at random, that leads itself to creating these caricatures of a type of guy, like we're talking about a Wojak, effectively, and not like an actual exploration of why this character is the way it is, or to challenge Tony on his own sort of standards here, an actual philosophical exploration of the prospect of rejection in the first place. It's just simply skating along the surface of, well, allegedly, one could say that a type of guy like this exists, but not any sort of the writerly expectation to then get into the depth of why this is the way it is, how it could be otherwise, or if this thing that we assume exists really exists at all once you actually get up close and examine
And I'm trying to now like figure out how one determines the sort of explanation but not
it.
kind of what that does or could mean. And part of it does seem like is like it is a failure of dialogism to the extent that like each of these stories, like they're sort of they're connected, but each of them individually only really focuses on the one guy. You
Mhm.
don't get sort of overlappingly complex characters. And that like means you don't see alternative responses to the same forces. You don't see how people diverge other than from their starting subject positions.
Mhm.
In fact, you see, to some extent, from what you're describing, it sounds like a single mechanism just operating like clockwork
Mm-hmm.
on a bunch of different subject positions.
Yes.
And so with the feminist,
Mm-hmm.
um, I really don't want to sound like I'm doing. I'm trying to sort of avoid here the
Uh-huh.
woke cliche of doing okay, well, this should offer a positive alternative to
Yeah.
show that the character is bad, but like there is a sense. Well, okay, so the whole structure of the discourse that story produced, and incidentally, the whole whatever the rejection letter at the end. I mean, I'm sure it got at least one real rejection letter because
Right.
any book you're shopping around to publishers will get at least one real rejection
Yeah.
letter.
That's just the
But
publishing world in
as a
large.
framing device, it is somewhat less plausible than a Fuccboi's story of how it came into existence,
Mm-hmm.
because this is not a book that was set up to fail. The
No.
Feminist came out was a viral discourse story. In many ways, it felt like at the time, pre-COVID,
Mm-hmm.
the book came out after, but when the Feminist came out,
Mm-hmm.
literally 5 years before Rejection,
Mm-hmm.
um, I remember it feeling like the successor and response to Cat Person.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone was reading it in like and arguing about it in much the same way. It was massively viral.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and
I mean, even
when
just
I
on
go on
the
Wiki,
level of platform that it was published on, it came out at N+1. And it's even further
yeah,
reified by the fact that Ahegao came out in the Paris Review like several years later. So
we had apparently a nonfiction piece called "The Rejection Plot."
yeah.
Um, and before that, his first novel, "Private Citizens," which I have not. I did see in a bookstore once, but nobody ever really talks about it.
Hmm.
Um, was one of Jonathan Franzen's favorite novels of the decade.
Huh.
But
Okay.
anyway, speaking of this same, the Wikipedia summary of him is really funny and
Hmm.
kind of it. It's almost a red herring. It represents really one side of the discourse,
Uh-huh.
but um, the the feminist is described as receiving criticism from some feminists and embraced by some anti-feminists. Although I definitely those are two sums that are um aligned with each other, and I definitely saw some sums on the other hand. It was a controversial in the proper sense
Hmm.
story. Tulathimutte stressed that he did not share the views of its narrator, but after its publication said that in practice everyone projected their own politics onto it. Anyway, like,
Hmm.
so the extent to which, as a discourse object, it basically prompted the question, and this was even before, you had anywhere near the current sort of wave of heteropessimism or heterofatalism.
Hmm.
It was is this saying feminism has gone too far, or is this about how uh fucking white males misinterpret and make feminism all about themselves and their feelings and become incels?
Hmm.
Um, basically, and the way it can be read out in the fulcrum on which it can be read out in either direction is negative. It is like, is there a healthier response to the character's situation and feelings or not? And if there
Hmm.
is, could it be represented? Like, as compellingly, almost one might say, as the story, rather than in, say, a series of like therapy affirmations.
Right. And to kind of make clear my own position on that, since we're using this as the particular object, I also don't want to do the kind of woke cliche of like, oh, well, it's a bad story because he doesn't like go to therapy and, get over his problems or anything like that. No, 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 no. That's not my issue with this at all. I have a complaint about how it collapses into this type of guy because again, like the way that the novel or the short story is constructed does not, in my opinion, adequately show why the character of Craig goes from being like this ardent male feminist where he literally cannot think in any other way except outside of, well, let me do that again. He cannot seem to think in any way except through this framework that he has established for himself, into the type of guy that then creates a forum for essentially like incels that are, put upon and things like that, that eventually collapses into, as Angie was talking about at one point, kind of the hystericizing subject in Lacanian terms, which then terminates into going back to a restaurant where he had like a bad social encounter with like a family at one point, and then goes to shoot up the place. I definitely have a complaint about that, but that's just because, again, it's a kind of awkward welding of two types of guy without, again, adequately showing the sort of flip between the two. My sort of concern about this is we are looking into this specific individual, right? We're not looking into a Wojak of a male feminist. We're looking at this male feminist in particular. And in the very intro, there is allegedly some groundwork to establish why he's like this, except it doesn't actually get into why he's like this. Like, it doesn't actually answer the question of what would compel someone to become this thing. What sort of thought processes or what sort of encounters led to him becoming the way that he is, thinking the way that he thinks, other than just simply that he downloaded a personality from online, seemingly, is the only sort of adequate explanation as he sort of vomits up these white male feminist cliches, which are themselves sort of vomited up from various kinds of, discourse about how one should conduct oneself in a feminist, anti-racist way, etc., from a particular sort of online milieu. It As someone, I'm not going to speak for the both of us, but I think we've from various conversations we have had to deal with sort of neuroses around various sorts of social contradictions that can lead potentially to a type of guy like this. And so there is a little bit of, at least on my part of there, but for the grace of God go I, for at least half of this sort of thing.
There was the same for me when I read it all the way back in 2019.
Yeah.
So that has informed my perspective on it.
Yes. And in that case, like, to kind of speak a little bit on my own sort of terms, I can understand the logic that led me to, at some points, call myself a male feminist before realizing, oh God, what a ghastly thing to kind of do to people as a result of that and the sort of political failures and all that sort of thing. And which involves a lot of various sort of contradictions of like how one is to be a man, just in general, the sort of negotiation of the contract, which was happening when feminism was becoming the global meme, as you were kind of talking about, that was forming this kind of revolutionary subject, seemingly in the tens at that time, along with various responses to various political situations and so on and so forth, and kind of how.
And this is sorry.
Oh.
No, keep going.
Yeah. As far as like how that's being renegotiated, and then also on top of that, the failure states of that, and like the sort of unresolved kind of elements, including some elements of like, again, to kind of tie into like the social sort of aspect of that, where like there is seemingly a social that is being imposed upon subjects that may not actually exist, but there's sort of, again, various new sincerities, to kind of play on that sort of term, that are being negotiated, but without necessarily all the participants of that new sincerity being able to negotiate that and that sort of thing. And so I can kind of understand, at least in my case, how certain contradictions collapse in certain ways that led me to these sorts of expressions and that sort of thing. Although I do want to make very plain that I not in the way that this short story is depicting.
Yeah,
I
I
do
mean,
want
the
to
way
make
that the short story does it is so extreme that it's
yes,
like it's a provocation, like
exactly.
clearly, and also it is so like I was gonna say like. Uh, I'm sure there are examples of guys who have made this exact may not to that extreme
Mhm.
because like the number of actually existing mass shooters can be tracked on one website along with their high scores,
Yes.
but like um who have made this flip, done a reverse RFH, even if I can't think of any off the top of my head,
Mhm.
and then I realized, oh wait, the real life subject of this story is fucking Tatsuya Ishida.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Which, like, again, with Tatsuya Ishida, like, there are
Far
much.
more interesting story.
Yes,
Far more interesting
it's a far more interesting
story.
story, and more importantly to this, there's a lot more of the sort of seams of why he became the way he became.
Yeah.
Whereas this is just completely uninterested. Like the summary of why he is like this is basically like the first two paragraphs, which is he went originally or came from a high school which was originally an all girls school. Or at least it was sort of true. He was one of 5 males at a progressive private school that has gone co ed just before he'd enrolled. And so there's this expected social pressure of, oh, you must have been a lucky guy. You must have had like a lot of, romantic success and things like that, except he never did, with a kind of like disparaging aside in a very awkward way to the character of Allison, basically saying that he had one possible suitor, but basically she was too fat. So I guess he wasn't about that. Um, it, value judgments on that aside. Still, school ingrained in him, if not feminist values per se, and this is quoting from the story itself, the value of feminist values. It had been cool or at least normal to identify as asexual, and though he didn't, he figured it was a better label than virgin. So even in those two sort of statements right there, those two statements are doing a lot of work for explaining the psychology of this guy, which it ultimately cannot sustain. His going to an all-girls school would not necessarily lead to him being this type of obnoxious, always-on male feminist figure.
And
Um,
conversely, it's not necessary. As someone who
yes,
did go to a like 3, 4, it almost feels like it's like over sort of backstorying because at I went to a school that was like 3/4 girls because it was an art school,
uh-huh,
but of guys that you'd meet like this, that's a rare case.
yeah,
It's most of them were socialized in normal environments.
yeah, and that's kind of a little bit of my point is that like it's over backstorying in the sense of what it's doing in the text, which ultimately is nothing. At the end of the day. It doesn't serve to explain why he collapsed on this particular ideological point. It doesn't serve to explain why he's collapsing in these particular contradictions that he does throughout the story. It just seemingly seems to offer like I don't know if I'm misusing the term that you kind of use, but it's a content negating sort of explanation. It's there to serve as like, oh, well, clearly he must have been like this because he went to an all girls school and he couldn't get laid. Which, like, that doesn't serve to explain why he then turns male feminist. That would explain maybe why he would turn
Yeah.
incel initially. But he doesn't turn incel initially. He does this move first as, like, allegedly a compensation for that, but also maybe not really at the end of the day. Like, it just does not get into why like the actual
Like how he
mental
processes this specific information.
yes, exactly, like the actual mechanics of what led this man to become this way are just completely neglected in favor of instead, wow, look at this fucking loser, effectively.
Well, again, there is an implication in like when he's like it seemed like a good thing to be.
Hmm.
And here is something of the problem. Um, it is like it's implying that from this environment, that is the default subjectivity he would, and that is him like his shift to incel is the product of his mechanical internal buildup, whereas his being a like obsessive male feminist is the kind of inertial external like product of his social environment. Now he's got these resentments built up in the back there, which may cause him to over-identify further, but there's not a clear distinction, again, between what is over-identification and what is normal identification within this environment. The implication, maybe, if I were to just like follow you kind of have to read these things in the negative. You kind of have to like read from the negative spaces to figure out what they're saying. Like then would be okay. He didn't have any romantic success, so he didn't have an actual woman who is interested in him personally and or sexually to teach him the distinctions between what is put forth in discourse and what is like what women want as people. And like the question of whether that needs to be done in a like heterosexual context is the fulcrum on which both the woke anti-woke reading split and the look at this fucking loser implication of the story kind of turns, where his literal inceldom, his virginity, etc., means that he has no access to a world outside of discourse. He does have friends, and his friends, like in real life, clearly seem to be a source of like at least part of the feedback loop with his like neurosis. But he is never really able to make contact with them, nor do they seem really able to make contact with him. And the internet itself, again, despite clearly being the source of all these archetypes, is itself elided as a socializing force for both him and his friends.
Yes. Yeah, because there's several dialogues that happen where there's a lot of this happening in the background. I'm thinking in particular of the comment from one of his friends about like a rather distressing and gross encounter, like sexual encounter that she inadvertently had with a guy that I guess she was dating or things like that. And everyone kind of responds to, "Oh, men suck," and things like that, to which Craig is going like, yeah, men suck. And then immediately his friend follows up with, "Well, I'll just marry him. I guess I'll be marrying him in about 3 to 5 years anyway," which then sets off the contradiction of like, wait, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, this guy effectively assaulted you, and yet you're just laughing it off like it's no big deal. Like, just feeding into this whole contradiction, which has a lot of like background social and libidinal sort of machinery going on that is never made privy to him. And for whatever reason, whether it's because he's just a moron or because he just doesn't know what he doesn't know, he doesn't have the ability to like negotiate and get around the current obstacle in order to access anything or go research anything that would give him a sort of ability to lift out of that immediate contradiction to go, okay, this isn't, there's more compartmentalization that's happening here than I'm immediately privy to. Like, it's not collapsing
Well,
on
let's
one
break
problem.
the dichotomy down. That
Mhm.
either he's a moron or he just doesn't know what he doesn't know.
Uh,
Okay, those are like extreme alternatives that sit on either side of a like fairly direct hypothetical that
mm,
can once again that once again has to be read out of the negative space,
mhm,
which is to say, like Percival in the Grail Castle,
mhm,
he doesn't just ask. And that is a
hmm.
very realistic, I think, I don't think that's an
Ye
unrealistic piece of characterization because
that is true. That
just
is true.
observationally,
Mhm.
like
People don't
people
ask.
are, yeah.
Yo, what's up with this? Like, because you're too caught up in the moment as it currently exists. You're too
And you're
stuck
not
in the
even caught up in
discursive
the
field.
moment as it currently exists. You're caught up in the script of the moment. Sorry,
Hmm.
I'm going a bit too TLP here, but like
You're
you're
good.
you're caught up in the script of the moment of how you are supposed to respond, how other people are treating it. You aren't supposed to like notice your own confusion. Now I'm going Yudkowsky. Like, and you are supposed to, especially and as a kind of fetish of like a social fetish of every generation since Gen X, which does not appear to have really reversed at any point. Again, ironically, except maybe online, you are
Hmm.
supposed to remain chill at all times if that is the mode of the interaction, which again
Hmm.
explains part of the other character's behavior if
Hmm.
the main character like thought to analogize from his own inaction, but you can't do that because that's operating below the conscious level, and also he's like a narcissist, probably,
Hmm.
in the very broad Lashian sense.
Right.
So yeah, in that sense, I also don't think the having the sense of him having downloaded like seemingly this whole cloth personality,
Hmm.
and then when it can't sustain the pressure, flipping to a whole other prefab personality is necessarily that unrealistic. That's
Hmm.
how a lot of ideological reversals I've seen have played out IRL, although
Hmm.
I don't think it does justice to the kind of frog boil leading up to that,
Yeah,
which
that's what I was trying to
itself
get
is
at.
a that's a like formally challenging. I feel like you have to use almost more genre effects
Hmm.
to get that. There's a reason I'm always comparing like people's political like escalation spirals to Hinamizawa syndrome.
Right. Yeah, it's you have to tap into tropes of horror in order to get
Yeah.
at anything remotely the affective, if nothing else, um, lead into that sort of thing. Which, yeah, I think was part of my problem is that like it's just like okay, he has one bad crash out at the woke picnic, right? And then suddenly he's just automatically like Yukio Mishimaing it up. And obsessing over like creatine and shit like that. Like it's just it's like how do we get from A to F on this one? It's just like overnight blank smash cut to now he's this way, instead of actually showing the transformation, so to speak. Um, although I think that's I don't know, is that a problem with the mediation of that? Probably not.
To return to that Bovary comparison,
Mhm,
and we'll probably return to that again because again like bovarism in this like historical sense is one of these problems that is really returning in a big way to fiction,
mhm,
um but that sense in which Flaubert can make something more beautiful of her condition than she could herself, which is also what's strikingly absent in these stories.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is that for that to be present would risk the appearance of sympathy. And
Mm-hmm.
the appearance of the absence, it's not even as if, again, I'm not trying to frame this from a simplistically anti-woke angle where it's like, oh, he has to pretend to be like, the appearance of sympathy is already part of the game of this story. Like, it is what produces it as a discourse object.
Mm-hmm.
It's not so much that it would make the possibility apparent as that it would almost risk collapsing the possibility. Because if he did sympathize to any meaningful extent, or even just empathize to any meaningful extent, including like really deep interiority of this character, it would become immediately apparent that no one else in the story has this.
Mm.
And you don't see anything of these characters other than what, like, the main character sees, and that would automatically, like, tip the scales to the point where, like, even if it wouldn't necessarily, like, be unreadable as a critique of him,
Mm-hmm.
in fact, if you did it well, it could be a more effective critique of him.
Yes.
Like, that would be, like, the thing people would read. People would be like, "Oh
Mm-hmm.
wow, this poor like male feminist young Werther is fucking like uh too good for this cynical woke society." And like in that sense, so the neutrality of the discourse story has to be a neutrality of negativity of, and
Mhm.
this kind of brings us back to like classics of American culture that ostensibly we had gotten past, like South Parkian, it makes fun of everybody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Which I think that actually
And then you get
leads.
to argue about who's worse.
Yes. Yes.
And on that note, I will also throw in the little um, embarrassing bit that I would say I am still like, I would still, even when I'm not being neurotic about it, like
Mm-hmm.
call myself a male feminist. I don't think that should be. I think this story is literally one of the things that tipped the discourse to the point that that is an inherently negative identification,
Hmm.
even within feminism. And that is like one of the lasting cultural effects. Like, again, it was already a discourse, it's
Mm-hmm.
real, like the type that this refers to. Um, and again, it'd be worse in many ways and more accurate if it reflected him just processing his resentments within his like um feminist persona,
Mm-hmm.
which he is mercifully like too socially inept to do. um but like the effective, I could almost draw a line. Again, this is attributing historical forces to individual artistic interventions, but like it is after this and then COVID, which like this was one of the last post-COVID cultural moments, that you get the heteropessimist, heterofatalist formulation,
Mm-hmm.
the conclusion like drilled into people's minds that like, no, you cannot fix them. If you try to be anything else, you
Mm-hmm.
will fail and flip into this.
Right.
And like maybe the only good like way to be is some kind of like golden retriever himbo who is so impenetrable to second order signs
Mm-hmm.
that like you won't be corrupted by them, but have some kind of like innate like Prince Mishkin goodness underneath.
Uh-huh.
But the second order signs cannot solve the problem created by the second order signs, and socialization cannot solve the problem, even though socialization in this story does not really occur. Which means that both of the premises of 2010's feminism are failed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, on my own sort of kind of feelings about that, it's like it's I do not think it is inherently suspicious for a man to attempt to interact with, like feminist theory, feminist kind of precepts and things like that. Like that feels almost like a given if you were to take the world seriously. That you should interact with that that whole infrastructure and things like that, for lack of a better term. It's the calcifying into making it into a lifestyle brand, effectively, that
Yes,
then
an
you get to be a
identity.
problem. Yes. Rather than just a doing of it, you are a being it, for lack of a better term.
Yes, which is really, if one were to go deeper and like analytically deeper, but also like one would have to go aesthetically deeper to represent this aesthetically.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of the solution to the problem presented by all of these,
Mm-hmm.
and which Fuccboi, to its credit, again, like does kind of arrive at, but that like all of these problems stem from trying to be identities rather than do things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay.
Mm.